the forgotten tribe that ritually sacrificed Vikings deep within the primeval forests of the Baltic coastlands, where ancient groves harbored spirits older than Norse memory, and tribal fires burned in clearings untouched by Viking expansion. There existed a people so fierce and spiritually powerful that they became the hunters rather than the hunted in the great game of medieval warfare. While history remembers the Vikings as unstoppable conquerors who terrorized Europe from their dragon-proud ships, there were those who not only resisted Norse expansion, but systematically captured Viking warriors and subjected them to ritual sacrifices so elaborate and terrifying that even the most battle-hardened Norse raiders would whisper prayers to their gods when sailing near these forbidden shores. These were the Prussians, the Baltic tribal confederation, whose warrior priests wielded spiritual powers that could turn Viking conquerors into sacrificial offerings for ancient deities that demanded proof of devotion through the systematic ritual execution of their most feared enemies. This is the investigation into the forgotten Prussian tribes whose sophisticated religious and military culture enabled them to capture, torture, and ritually sacrifice Viking warriors in elaborate ceremonies that reveal how indigenous peoples developed effective resistance strategies against Norse expansion through the systematic reversal of Viking terror tactics. Through examination of archaeological evidence from Prussian ritual sites, contemporary accounts from Christian chroniclers, and surviving Norse sources, analysis of specialized ceremonial weapons, and ritual artifacts, skeletal remains that document systematic ritual execution of captured Vikings, and the testimony preserved in both Baltic and Scandinavian sources about these extraordinary reversals of medieval power dynamics, we uncover the remarkable truth about a tribal culture that successfully terrorized the supposed terrorizers of medieval Europe. Today, we explore the sophisticated military and religious systems that enabled Prussian tribes to systematically defeat and capture Viking raiders, examining their ritual practices that transformed captured Norse warriors into sacrificial offerings, the spiritual beliefs that justified and empowered their resistance to Viking expansion, the archaeological evidence that documents their success in reversing traditional medieval power relationships, and the long-term consequences of their resistance strategies that influenced both Viking tactical approaches and broader patterns of medieval warfare throughout the Baltic region. Drawing upon evidence from excavated Prussian strongholds and ritual sites throughout modern-day Poland, Lithuania, and the Kaliningrad region, along with analysis of specialized ritual weapons designed for ceremonial execution, sacrificial altar complexes, and the distinctive burial practices that marked the systematic ritual sacrifice of captured Viking warriors, we reveal how indigenous tribal culture developed sophisticated mechanisms for transforming military defense into spiritual warfare that struck at the very heart of Norse warrior mythology. The archaeological evidence from Prussian tribal territories reveals extensive fortification systems and ritual complexes specifically designed to facilitate the capture and ceremonial execution of Viking raiders, with excavations showing sophisticated defensive installations that were integrated with religious sites capable of conducting elaborate sacrificial ceremonies involving multiple captured enemies. Excavations at sites like Trousseau and other major Prussian centers show clear evidence of specialized facilities designed for the long-term imprisonment of captured Vikings, including underground chambers with drainage systems for ritual bloodletting, ceremonial platforms designed for public execution ceremonies, and burial complexes where the remains of ritually sacrificed Norse warriors were interred according to Prussian religious traditions that transformed their enemies' deaths into spiritual offerings to Baltic deities. The military strategies employed by Prussian tribes against Viking raiders were based on sophisticated intelligence networks and tactical approaches that exploited Viking overconfidence while using their enemies' own aggressive tendencies as weapons against them, with contemporary accounts describing how Prussian warriors would deliberately allow small Viking raiding parties to penetrate deep into Baltic territories before surrounding and capturing them for transport to ritual sites where they would face ceremonial death. Archaeological analysis of Prussian weapons and armor shows clear evidence of military equipment specifically designed for capturing rather than killing enemies, including specialized nets, restraint devices, and non-lethal weapons that enabled Prussian warriors to take Viking prisoners alive for later ritual sacrifice. The religious framework that justified and empowered Prussian resistance to Viking expansion was based on ancient Baltic spiritual traditions that viewed the ritual sacrifice of foreign invaders as essential offerings to tribal deities who demanded proof of devotion through the systematic execution of enemies who threatened traditional territorial and spiritual boundaries. Contemporary accounts from Christian chroniclers describe Prussian religious ceremonies involving captured Vikings as elaborate multi-day festivals that combined community celebration with ritual activities that required the active participation of entire tribal populations in the systematic spiritual and physical destruction of their most feared enemies. The specialized ritual practices that Prussian tribes developed for the ceremonial execution of captured Vikings involved sophisticated ceremonial procedures that were designed to maximize both the spiritual value of the sacrifice and the psychological impact on any surviving Viking witnesses who might escape to warn other Norse raiders about the fate that awaited them in Prussian territories. Archaeological evidence from Prussian ritual sites shows clear signs of elaborate ceremonial infrastructure designed for conducting systematic ritual executions, including specialized altar complexes, drainage systems for collecting sacrificial blood, and amphitheater-like arrangements that allowed large tribal audiences to witness the ceremonial death of captured Viking warriors. The seasonal timing of Prussian ritual sacrifices was carefully coordinated with traditional Baltic religious observances and agricultural cycles, with major ceremonial executions of captured Vikings scheduled to coincide with harvest festivals and solstice celebrations that provided occasions for community-wide religious events involving the systematic offering of Norse warriors to tribal deities in ceremonies that combined thanksgiving for successful defense with requests for continued divine protection against foreign invasion. Contemporary accounts describe these seasonal sacrificial ceremonies as lasting for days and involving the systematic execution of multiple captured Vikings according to ritual procedures that required different forms of ceremonial death for warriors of different ranks and origins. The psychological warfare aspects of Prussian ritual sacrifice practices extended far beyond their immediate victims to create climates of fear throughout the Viking world that influenced Norse military strategy and territorial expansion plans in ways that effectively limited Viking penetration into Baltic regions through the systematic terrorization of potential raiders who understood that capture meant not quick death in battle, but prolonged ritual torture followed by ceremonial execution. Contemporary Norse sources reveal clear evidence that Viking military leaders modified their strategic approaches to Baltic expansion specifically to avoid confrontation with Prussian tribes whose reputation for ritual sacrifice had become so notorious that many Norse warriors refused to participate in raids against Prussian territories. The capture techniques employed by Prussian warriors against Viking raiders involved sophisticated ambush strategies and specialized military tactics that were specifically designed to take Norse fighters alive rather than simply defeating them in conventional battle. With archaeological evidence suggesting that Prussian military culture developed elaborate systems for the systematic capture and transport of enemy warriors that required specialized training and equipment designed to overcome Viking combat skills while preserving captives for later ritual sacrifice. Contemporary accounts describe Prussian capture techniques that involved the use of nets, specialized restraint weapons, and coordinated group tactics that could overwhelm even elite Viking warriors while keeping them alive for ceremonial execution. The ritual preparations that captured Vikings underwent before their ceremonial execution involved elaborate ceremonial procedures that were designed to transform Norse warriors from enemies into sacred offerings through processes that combined physical and spiritual preparation for sacrifice with psychological techniques that were intended to break Viking resistance while preparing them for their roles as ritual victims. Archaeological evidence from Prussian ritual sites shows clear signs of specialized preparation areas where captured Vikings underwent systematic ritual treatment that could last for weeks before their final ceremonial execution. The ceremonial execution methods employed by Prussian tribes against captured Vikings involved sophisticated ritual procedures that were designed to maximize both the spiritual effectiveness of the sacrifice and the entertainment value for tribal audiences, with different execution techniques reserved for Vikings of different ranks and origins according to religious traditions that required specific forms of ceremonial death to satisfy the demands of particular Baltic deities. Contemporary accounts describe execution methods that combined elements of ritual torture with ceremonial procedures that were intended to ensure the complete spiritual destruction of Viking enemies while providing religious and social benefits for Prussian tribal communities. The burial practices that Prussian tribes employed for ritually sacrificed Vikings reveal sophisticated religious beliefs about the spiritual transformation of enemies through ceremonial death, with archaeological evidence showing that Norse warriors who had been ritually executed were buried according to Prussian religious traditions that were intended to ensure their permanent incorporation into Baltic spiritual systems while preventing their return to Scandinavian religious contexts. Analysis of burial sites associated with ritual sacrifice shows clear evidence of specialized interment procedures that were designed to mark the complete spiritual conquest of Viking enemies through their transformation from Norse warriors into Prussian religious offerings. The international impact of Prussian ritual sacrifice practices against Vikings influenced medieval diplomatic and military relationships throughout the Baltic region, with contemporary accounts revealing how knowledge of Prussian ceremonial execution of Norse warriors affected trade relationships, military alliances, and territorial expansion strategies among various medieval powers who understood that successful resistance to Viking expansion was possible through the systematic reversal of Norse terror tactics. Byzantine and Arab sources describe Prussian ritual sacrifice practices as examples of indigenous resistance strategies that effectively countered Viking military advantages through the systematic exploitation of Norse religious and psychological vulnerabilities. The decline of Prussian ritual sacrifice practices occurred gradually during the medieval period as changing military technologies and the Christianization of the Baltic region created new strategic and religious contexts that made traditional ceremonial execution of enemies less effective as both military strategy and religious practice, though modified versions of these resistance techniques continued to influence Baltic military culture well into the later medieval period. Archaeological evidence suggests that Prussian tribes maintained specialized ritual capabilities for ceremonial execution of captured enemies long after their initial conflicts with Viking raiders, adapting their traditional practices to address new military and religious challenges presented by other medieval powers. The documentation of Prussian ritual sacrifice practices in medieval sources required careful interpretation of fragmented accounts from multiple cultural perspectives, as both Norse and Christian chroniclers had strong motivations for either minimizing or exaggerating the effectiveness of indigenous resistance to Viking expansion, leading to complex literary traditions that preserved accurate information about these practices within narratives that reflected the political and religious biases of their authors. Contemporary accounts reveal how knowledge of Prussian ceremonial execution of Vikings influenced European perceptions of both Norse military capabilities and indigenous resistance potential throughout the medieval period. The legacy of Prussian ritual sacrifice practices against Vikings extended far beyond their immediate historical period to influence broader patterns of indigenous resistance to European expansion and the development of military strategies that exploited the psychological vulnerabilities of supposedly superior invading forces through the systematic reversal of terror tactics and the strategic use of religious ceremony as both military weapon and community defense mechanism. As we examine this remarkable example of indigenous resistance to Viking expansion, we discover how sophisticated tribal cultures developed effective strategies for countering supposedly superior military forces through the systematic exploitation of their enemies' religious beliefs and psychological assumptions, revealing the complex dynamics of medieval warfare that extended far beyond simple military technology to encompass spiritual, psychological, and cultural factors that could determine the outcomes of conflicts between different civilizations. The story of Prussian ritual sacrifice of Viking warriors reminds us that historical narratives of conquest and expansion often obscure the sophisticated resistance strategies employed by indigenous peoples who successfully defended their territories against supposedly irresistible invading forces, and that understanding the complete picture of medieval warfare requires us to acknowledge the effectiveness of indigenous military and religious systems that could transform would-be conquerors into ceremonial offerings for ancient deities who demanded proof of devotion through the systematic ritual execution of foreign invaders.